Hello again, welcome back to the channel. In this video we're going to be looking at the human digestive system. First we'll start off by listing the 7 main food groups, and then we'll talk about the jobs of the digestive system. We'll then be labeling a diagram of the human digestive system. We'll talk about the functions of the different parts of the digestive system. And then we'll talk about the difference between digestion and excretion. So let's dig in. Okay, so the 7 main food groups. I often end up leaving some of these out, but let's see if I can get through the entire list. So carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, fiber, vitamins, minerals, and water. So those are the 7 main food groups. Once you've broken down food, you need to have enough of each of these to actually be healthy. And that's what we describe as a balanced diet. But how do we absorb all of this stuff? That's where the digestive system comes in. So let's list the 2 main jobs of the digestive system. So number 1, ingest food and breaks it down into smaller molecules. And then the next bit is it absorbs the products of digestion into the blood. Okay, so let's go on to labeling the diagram. I'm going to conceal the diagram for a second, and I'll let you think about the labels and see if you can actually make it through all of them. I'll give you a minute for this one, so pause for a minute and then come back. Pause now. Okay, so you've had a chance to label the diagram on your own. Let's see how many of the labels you got right. Some of them are quite tricky. So here we go. So those are the parts of the digestive system. So if we start at the top and work our way around, you have the mouth and you have the salivary glands, and they cut and crush the food to make it easier to swallow. And then you've got a muscular pipe called the esophagus, sometimes spelt without the O, which connects the mouth to the stomach and helps to facilitate the movement of food from the mouth to the stomach by waves of muscle contraction called peristalsis. We'll come across that again later, so don't need to try to memorize this for now. The next part of the digestive system is the stomach. In the stomach, the food that's come in is further digested, but the main food that's digested in the stomach, pretty much the only food that's digested in the stomach, is protein. And that's where the proteins that come in your food are broken down completely into their constituent amino acids. So when you eat protein, let's say for instance cow proteins in beef, you don't incorporate cow proteins into your body. Instead, you break down the cow proteins, beef proteins, into the component building blocks, amino acids, which we can then use as building blocks for our own proteins. We'll talk more about that in the future. Afterwards, you've got the pancreas, which has two main functions. It controls blood glucose levels, but also produces the last batch of really important enzymes in a mixture called pancreatic juice. And pancreatic juice completes the digestion of most of the rest of the food that's left in the small intestine. Then you have the liver, which has a whole range of different functions. With regard to the digestive process, its main function is the production of something called bile, which we'll talk about later. And the bile produced by the liver is then stored in a structure called the gallbladder. We then move on to the next major structure, the small intestine. The small intestine is where digestion is completed, and then the products of digestion are absorbed into the body. Then you go on to the large intestine, which is responsible for absorbing water out of the food. And then the food then eventually ends up, or whatever is left of the food which you haven't digested, ends up in a muscular chamber called the rectum. The rectum stores food for a length of, or stores feces for a length of time until it needs to be removed from the body through a ring of muscle, a sphincter called the anus. That's pretty much the journey. Now, I did skip one, the appendix. In humans, the appendix has limited function, but there are some ideas as to what it might do in the human body, and we'll talk about those later. So that's a diagram of the human digestive system with the main structures you would need to be able to label if you were given a blank diagram. So you need to know these structures. You need to find a way to learn them off by heart. The best way to do that is to label and relabel the diagram as often as it takes till the material sticks. Okay, so on to the next page. So the next page, we're going to be looking at the functions of all of these structures that we've labeled on the diagram. So we need to think about what their functions are. I'll give you 3 minutes this time. Actually, longer than that. Let's think 10 minutes. So pause the video for about 10 minutes and then see if you can work out what the functions of these different parts are. Use the internet, textbooks, whatever you need to, see if you can work them out, and then come back after 10 minutes. Pause now. Okay, so let's have a look. So here is the completed table, and I'll take you through some of these functions. So let's start off with the mouth. So in the mouth, you've got mechanical and chemical digestion. What does that mean? So mechanical digestion is cutting, grinding, chopping up food in the mouth in order to form it into a paste that's easier to swallow. But it also increases the surface area available for enzymes to work on the food. The next job of the mouth is basically the chemical digestion. It's the first place where chemical digestion is seen. And in the mouth, there's an enzyme called amylase in the saliva, which starts the breakdown of starch. And it converts starch into something called maltose, which is a slightly simpler, a simpler carbohydrate, which will itself have to be broken down further. We'll talk more about that when we actually do digestion in the future. Okay, so that was the mouth, and we talked about the salivary glands. Let's have a look at the esophagus. So the esophagus is a muscular tube, as I said earlier when we labeled the diagram. connecting the mouth to the stomach. And it is, as I said, made up of muscle, and it uses waves of muscle contractions called peristalsis to actually move the chewed up food from the mouth to the stomach. It doesn't just fall down into the stomach, it's actually moved down in gentle waves of muscle contraction. Next, we've got the stomach. So the stomach is a muscular bag which completes the digestion of proteins, or actually finishes, or actually carries out the digestion of proteins. And in the stomach, because proteins are so important, it takes quite a while to get as much of the protein as possible broken down into its component amino acids. And that's why food stays in the stomach for somewhere between 4 and 6 hours, depending on the situation. And as such, that gives the stomach more than enough time to break down pretty much all of the proteins that are taken in. And it does that by a combination, yet again, of both mechanical and chemical digestion. The mechanical digestion in the form of something called churning. So the muscles in the stomach basically turn the stomach into something akin to a liquidizer. And like a liquidizer, you want to keep the lid on, or else you end up with stuff shooting all over the place. And that could be quite antisocial. You don't want stuff shooting out of your mouth like something from The Exorcist, and you don't want it shooting out of the other end, your bum, causing rather uncomfortable tingling because there'd be acid within it. So on both fronts, you really want to keep the material in your stomach there whilst the churning is going on. And that's why you have sphincters at either end of it. Sphincters are rings of muscle. We'll come across another ring of muscle later, but they're rings of muscle which block off the top and the bottom of the stomach to prevent the contents shooting all over the place during churning. It also contains enzymes, proteases, which break down proteins into their constituent or component amino acids. The stomach doesn't actually absorb any of this stuff. It just carries out the digestion. Once the time has elapsed and the sphincter opens up at the bottom, the contents of the stomach then move on to the small intestine. But that's not the next one we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the liver next. So the liver is your largest internal organ. Think for a second as to what your largest organ in general is. I'll give you 10 seconds to think about it. Pause now. Okay, if you guessed the skin, you're right. Your skin is your largest organ, but your largest internal organ is your liver. Okay, what's the job of the liver? Two jobs. It removes toxins from the products of digestion after you've absorbed them, but it also produces something called bile, and bile helps to emulsify fats. It's a bit like fairy liquid for washing up dishes, and what it does is it breaks up the large lumps of fat into small little bubbles of fat, and those have a much greater surface area, and that makes it much easier for lipases to break down the fats in the small intestine. Okay, and then there's the gallbladder. The gallbladder is a small sac which stores bile after it's been made by the liver and then releases it when it's needed into the small intestine. The next step is the pancreas. So the pancreas, I mentioned earlier, has two functions. It produces hormones which help to regulate the blood glucose levels, which is important, but is not directly linked to digestion. Instead, it's a peripheral link in the sense that we get the glucose that's in your blood from breaking down carbohydrates. And once you end up with a high level of glucose in your blood, you use insulin to convert it into things like glycogen. That way it doesn't affect your water potential. However, if the reverse is required and you need more glucose, what you do is you break down glycogen and other substances back into glucose using a substance or a hormone called glucagon. Okay, so let's go on to the small intestine now. So the small intestine has multiple different parts, but the two main parts that we're going to be concerned with are the duodenum, or the duodenum, whichever way you choose to pronounce it, which is where digestion is completed. It's the first bit after the stomach. So it's where digestion is completed, and it uses the pancreatic juice from the pancreas, which is a mixture of enzymes, which is the second function of the pancreas. And once you end up with the nutrients from the breakdown of food, those nutrients are then absorbed into the body, into the blood. Maybe not necessarily the blood directly. Sometimes some of these products of digestion end up going into something called your lymphatic system instead, but basically into your body rather than just traveling through the digestive tract. And so that second bit is the ileum. And the ileum is what's responsible for absorbing those products of digestion, as I said. And then we go on to the large intestine. So the large intestine is a larger pipe or tube than the small intestine, as the name probably suggests. And it's responsible for absorbing water from the digested food. So it absorbs water into the body. So pretty crucial function. It also contains bacteria, what are sometimes described as friendly bacteria. And what those bacteria do is they produce certain enzymes on our behalf, and they get to get some of the nutrients that we don't need. So it's a mutually beneficial arrangement, what we sometimes describe as mutualism or symbiosis. So they get something, we get something. And so that's the large intestine. And beyond, or in the latter part of the large intestine, what you've got are the bits of the food that you couldn't digest. So in humans, for instance, it could be fiber. So plant material like cellulose, which we don't really have the capacity to digest. So it just stays there, helping to form feces. And it also helps with something called digestive transit. It's how all of this material moves through the system much faster. If you don't have enough fiber, it moves much slower, and you end up with constipation because you absorb so much water out of it. It becomes a large solid mass that's quite difficult to remove. Then we go on to the appendix. So the appendix is a sort of dangly bit from the large intestine, and it doesn't seem to have that much of a function in humans, or at least we don't know for certain what its function is in humans. There are some ideas as to what its function is. So one idea is that it stores bacteria, which can then act as a reservoir for those friendly, useful bits of bacteria that I talked about earlier. And so if you've had something like diarrhea, which flushes out the large intestine, it ends up getting rid of quite a lot of that bacteria. So the appendix is thought to keep a nice reservoir of that bacteria in instances like that. Another idea is that it's just one of these hangovers or something left over from our evolutionary past that once had a function but doesn't anymore. it could be actually a combination of both. So yes, it used to have a totally different major function possibly, but we've now co-opted it to use it for something else, which is storing bacteria. Next, we've got the rectum, which is a muscular chamber where the feces, the leftover bits that were not digested from our food, are stored. We are social animals. As such, we don't really want to have our feces dropping out all over the place willy-nilly. So instead, it's stored there until an opportune time comes along where we can get rid of it or evacuate it from the body. Of course, if you keep the feces in there for too long, you'll end up with an automatic response, a reflex that causes you to evacuate it anyway. And then you have the anus, which is a muscular, a ring of muscle called a sphincter, which basically prevents the stuff, the feces in the rectum from simply falling out. And so that's what enables you to control the removal of feces from the rectum, as well as the fact that the rectum is itself surrounded by muscle that helps to squeeze out the contents, the feces. So those are the functions of the key parts of the human digestive system. The final thing we're going to look at is the difference between digestion and excretion. So what's the difference between digestion and excretion? You've probably heard of excretion, but you might not have heard of digestion. Many people are under the impression that when you remove feces, that is an example of excretion. In reality, it's mostly digestion. What you're doing is you're getting rid of material that has simply passed through the body in your digestive tract. That's what digestion is. Whereas excretion is the removal of substances that were already part of your body. So things like metabolic waste and other such substances that were part of your body which need to be removed. Now, I said that feces is mostly described as being digested, but actually there's some substances within feces that if you would be able to describe as being excreted. For instance, the substances that make your feces actually brown come from breaking down red blood cells, because red blood cells are recycled or cycled through the body quite quickly, not recycled, but cycled through the body quite quickly, and some components of them cannot be kept. And as such, they form the pigment that turns our poo brown, our feces brown. So that's the difference between digestion and excretion. Digestion involves the removal of substances that weren't part of the body, that simply pass through the body, whereas excretion is the removal of substances that were part of the body, for instance, metabolic waste. So that's the first part of our look at the human digestive system. So let's have a look at a summary of what we've done so far. So first we started off by looking at the 7 main food groups, all of which we need in varying amounts in order to have a balanced or healthy diet. Then we talked about the digestive system and we talked about its functions. In order to get all of those nutrients from the 7 main food groups, we need to break down food, which is often large insoluble molecules, into small, usually soluble molecules for absorption. So that's what digestion is. The other job of the digestive system is actually to absorb those nutrients. So what happens is the products of digestion are then absorbed in the small intestine into the body. Next, we talked about the different types of digestion, chemical and mechanical. Mechanical, cutting, chopping, grinding up food, makes it easier to swallow, makes it easier to pass through the digestive system, and it also increases the surface area for enzymes to work on, basically to speed up the action of enzymes on the food as it's being digested. And some examples of structures that do both mechanical and chemical digestion are the mouth and the stomach. In the mouth, the cutting, chewing, and grinding of food, and you also is mechanical. And then you also have the amylase in saliva, which helps to break down or starts the breakdown of starch. Then we went on to looking at what happens to substances that are not broken down within the digestive system. So we talked about the parts of the digestive system and their functions, and we labeled the diagram. And then we talked about what happens when some of these substances are not broken down. That's called digestion. So you can think of your digestive tract, your digestive system, as a tunnel through your body. The food passes through that tunnel, we take what we want out of it, and what's left pops out at the other end. So you can think of the food basically passing through your body. It's not actually part of your body, it's just passing through this tunnel where you're taking stuff out as you need it, and you're getting rid of the stuff that you couldn't digest. So that's what digestion is. Excretion is a different thing. Excretion is the removal of substances that were part of your body, such as metabolic waste like carbon dioxide and water vapor, and removing it from the body. And as I said, the removal of feces could be thought of as being partially digestion and partially excretion, because the pigment that makes your feces brown is actually excreted from the body because it was part of the body. Partly from, it's from breaking down red blood cells. And that was, in essence, where we stopped. So, as usual, I would suggest that you try to fill and refill the corresponding worksheet for this video. And to test yourself, which is a vital part of revision, to test yourself, you need to see if you can refill the worksheets from memory. It'll take you a little while to be able to do that, and every so often you're going to hit a snag where you can't remember something, and you should leave some time before you try to retest yourself after checking the answers. If you do that, the material tends to be retained a lot longer. If you found that useful, press the like button, and if you would like to be notified of future videos, press the subscribe button if you aren't already subscribed. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.